So let's talk about plant nutrition as it relates to soil science. And it has taken us a long time to arrive at this topic because we need to talk about a few other things first. So we have spoken about soil ecology and the life that exists in the soil. We've talked about the different parts of soil, the mineral components as well as the organic components. And we've talked about how water exists in the soil. So we're finally ready to talk about how do these plants get minerals from the soil? What's actually happening? And I call this talk plant nutrition because it's very similar to human nutrition, the study of how we get the nutrients through our food. And in this case, we know that plants get their food through the process of photosynthesis. When I say food, I mean the calories, all of the sugar that's produced with the energy of the sun. But there's other minerals that are required for plant growth, and the plant needs to get those from the soil. So if we want to carry this analogy of plant nutrition out to its fullest, you may say that the soil holds all of the vitamins, the vital minerals that the plant needs. And the plant gets its calories, though, from the sun. Humans, we're different because we get our energy plus all of our vitamins from the food we eat. But we are similar in the fact that we are made up of cells. And what really needs to happen is that our cells need minerals to go through the processes that they exhibit while they are alive. So you may think, oh, I need to eat because I get hungry and it's just something that I need to do. But really, when you eat, you're feeding your cells. And for plants, it's the same way. When the plants are taking in the minerals in the soil, they are taking them in literally through their cells, and then those minerals are transported and broken down so that they can be used within the cell. So we need to understand a little bit about all of those things we've talked about so far in order to fully appreciate plant nutrition and minerals in the soil. We will explore this topic over the course of 2 weeks. So this first week is an introduction to plant nutrition, and I'll discuss some of the concepts that you need to understand. And then next week, we will dive deeper into the minerals themselves and the exact role they play within the plants, as well as what deficiency symptoms you can look out for. So when we study plant nutrition, we are studying how the plant gets the chemical elements and compounds that are necessary for growth and life cycle completion. Growing is kind of the first general thing that all living things want to do. They want to be born and then grow, express themselves, mature. And then the next important step is reproduction. So oftentimes in a plant's life cycle, we will observe two main times when nutrients are needed. And that's when the plant is in a rapid growth phase, and then we'll need additional nutrients when the plant is ready to reproduce, ready to make a flower or develop that pollinated flower into a fruit. There are many essential elements that plants need. The vast majority of them come from the soil. So when we think of adding fertilizer or compost to the soil, we are adding the 17 essential elements, at least, that plants need. But it's not just the elements from the soil that the plant needs. In fact, if you look at the total volume of material that the plant needs in order to grow, the vast majority of it is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. But we don't typically add carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen to the soil as fertilizer because the plant does not receive those elements from the soil. The plant is getting the carbon, the oxygen, and the hydrogen from the atmosphere and from water. So when the plant takes in CO2, that's all the carbon that the plant needs. And when the plant pulls up H2O, water, it gets plenty of hydrogen. And in fact, doesn't really need the oxygen. That's just a byproduct that it needs to get rid of that excess oxygen. You can see the diagram on the left showing the tomato plant receiving CO2 and H2O, and that's coming in from the atmosphere and from the water in the soil. And then all the rest of the minerals are hanging out, present in the soil and waiting to be pulled in through the roots, dissolved in water. Why are the P, K, and N letters in red? Well, that's because those are the ones the plant needs the most. And so those are part of the macronutrients or the primary nutrients that the plant will need for growth. There are some exceptions to plants deriving minerals from the soil. And one example is parasitic plants. So these are plants that actually hook on to other plants and break into their cells and steal minerals as well as sugars from a host plant. And the image on the right-hand side is showing a parasitic plant. And if you look closely on the stalk of the grass, you can see tiny little structures on this parasitic plant that are actually engaging in the hijacking of the plant cells. So those are hooking into the plants. On the left-hand side, we see a familiar Venus flytrap, which is a carnivorous plant. It's a plant that eats bugs, and it doesn't do that in order to get the calories. So it's not decomposing the bug like a worm would, but it's actually having that fly break down and release minerals. The reason the Venus flytrap and other carnivorous plants need to eat bugs is because they typically grow in waterlogged soils, saturated soils. And while the soil is saturated, it tends to alter the pH. And when that happens, then certain minerals become unavailable at a very acidic pH. And in order to get the minerals, then they have to look elsewhere. They have to attract bugs and then have those bugs die inside the plant structures. And I wouldn't say they eat the bugs, it's more like the bugs decompose and release minerals in a way that the plant can absorb. But for the vast majority of plants, they are getting their minerals from the soil. So, what are the plants actually taking up? They're taking up elements. An element is the smallest unit of a mineral. We call the elements that the plant needs the essential elements. So, an element is a chemical element, just like on the periodic table of elements, and it's one that is required by an organism for healthy growth. If the plant needs a lot of a certain element, then we call that a macro element or a macronutrient because the plant needs a lot of it. And if it needs just a very small amount, we'll call those trace minerals or we will call them micronutrients. And all in all, there are 17 essential elements for plant growth and development that we know of. And we're learning more and more all the time. So this number may change as new discoveries are made, there are other elements that are beneficial to plants that are not on this list. But the reason these are called the essential elements is because the plant cannot produce these themselves. The plant needs to find them in the soil. All the other elements that are beneficial, up to 40, 42 beneficial elements, the plant can produce many of those if they can have access to the 17 essential elements. One big discovery in the history of soil science is Liebig's law. And officially it's called Justus von Liebig's law of the minimum. And this is a very simple concept, but it's an important one to understand. And the law states that growth is dictated not by total resources available, but by the scarcest resource, otherwise known as the limiting factor. And so, what this means is if you have all the essential elements in the soil, but you're missing, for instance, calcium, you could go and add all the nitrogen fertilizer in the world, and that plant will not be able to use the extra nitrogen because it's missing calcium. And so, one of the ways that we diagram this concept, it uses the metaphor of the barrel, and an old style wooden barrel that has different lengths of wood that go up to different heights. And you can imagine that if you try to fill this barrel with water, then whatever plank goes up to the shortest height is going to be where the water starts to leak out. And then if you can lengthen that piece of wood, then the water can rise up to the next lowest plank. And so that illustrates the concept of the law of the minimum, which is that it doesn't matter about the total amount of nutrients. All that matters is the one that's available in the least amount. And so when we apply minerals, fertilizers, or compost, we're wanting to make sure we're always applying a balance of all the things that the plant needs. But it's tricky because remember, the plant needs some elements in greater amounts than others. Interestingly, this law of the minimum can also be applied to populations and ecosystems for various factors, such as sunlight and mineral nutrients as well. So it's not just about one individual plant. You can talk about an entire forest this way, or a grassland, or even a population of animals. The population will grow up to the point where it is limited by the least available mineral. And if that mineral becomes supplied, then the population will keep growing until it maxes out at the next minimum available nutrient. It's a relatively easy concept to understand, but it has important implications with how we garden and how we manage soil because there's no point in adding what the plant does not need. So let's get a brief introduction to the macro elements. These are the elements that the plant needs in the greatest amounts. And I've listed them roughly in order of how much they need. So on the top, that's the greatest need. And then as you go down, you need less and less of them. It is important to memorize these. It's something that every soil science student all over the world spends their time doing, is memorizing the 17 essential elements and which ones are macro and which ones are micro. So you will need to memorize these, and it's helpful to come up with some method for memorizing or some mnemonic device. And everyone's free to come up with their own, and I'll share the ones that I use. So the macro elements In order of importance are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Remember, those three come from the atmosphere. The next three, the ones that come from the soil, are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Notice the elemental abbreviations are N, P, K. And if you know much about fertilizer, when you buy fertilizer, you're always looking at the NPK values. And in fact, the ratio of N, P, and K, it can be beneficial for different purposes. Next up, you have calcium, magnesium, and those two often go hand in hand with how they are used in the cells. And then finally, sulfur. So all of these are needed in large amounts. There was a time a few decades ago when we had other elements in this list, and then we realized, oh, those should be part of the micronutrients. And this list has grown as our understanding of plant nutrition has grown over time. To illustrate the concept of how important the top elements are, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and then nitrogen from the soil contribute to over 95% of a plant's biomass on a dry matter weight basis. So more than 95% of what makes up your plants and the plant cells are the first four of the macro elements. As far as what mnemonic device I use, I learned this back when we had different different elements in the macro category, and so the one that was taught to me, and a lot of people repeat it, is C. Hopkins Cafe. So CHOPKNS for calcium, and then they used to put iron in here, so it would be cafe. And iron went to the micro category, and magnesium came to the macro category. So I just changed it in my head and I said, C. Hopkins Camera Shop. It's kind of weird, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's what I use to remember. And C. Hopkins is supposed to be like somebody's name, C. Hopkins. And it works for me. You're welcome to come up with your own mnemonic device. You don't need to memorize these in any specific order, but you do need to know which one is a macro element and which one is a micro element. And here we have our micros. They are needed in very small amounts, so they're called the trace minerals. And you can see there that the micronutrients make up less than 0.02% of the dry weight of the plant. So a very, very small amount. And it's rare that you're deficient because they're not present in the soil. Oftentimes you're deficient because the pH of the soil makes these unavailable. And just because they're needed in a tiny amount, it doesn't mean that they're not needed at all. So if you don't have that tiny amount, you can't have any plant growth. A lot of times, if you add micronutrients as part of a fertilizer, you just add all the micros put together. You're not going to add zinc or copper or boron individually because it's such a small amount. Additionally, many of these elements can have toxicities on the other hand. So if you took copper, for instance, and put too much copper in the soil, your plants need a little bit, but if there's an overwhelming amount of copper, that can be a toxicity and cause additional problems. Just like you can have a toxicity if your body absorbs too much vitamin C. And oftentimes your body will eliminate the vitamin C if it's in excess. But if somehow you could hang on to that vitamin C, if you had over 4,000 milligrams in a day, that'd be a toxic dose and it would cause damage to you. So here we have our microelements. We have boron, chlorine, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, copper, iron, and nickel. So one of the difficult things to remember is manganese and molybdenum, and then to remember that manganese is Mn and molybdenum is Mo. So that's something you'll have to pay attention to, and it's worth it to study a little bit on this. I use a mnemonic device that's really strange and weird, and it works for me. And you can come up with your own. I won't share mine this time. I want you to make up your own, but you don't need to put these in the order I present them. And whatever works to help you be able to recall all of these. If we take all of our macros and all of our micros, that equals 17. And that's something you'll need to know. 17 essential elements. Now, all elements, it's important to understand that when we list these 17 essential elements, what we are listing are basically the single atom or the element from the periodic table that you learned about in chemistry class. Now, you may or may not know that just because these are the smallest unit, these are the actual atoms, and based on different numbers of protons and neutrons, we have these different elements. They don't typically exist in nature in their purest form. Most of the time, just like with H2O or CO2, the elements are combined to form molecules. And what elements are in which arrangement of molecule has a big impact on whether or not your plant can absorb it. So, to discuss some terminology and to clarify, the atoms are single neutral particles. They are not charged, they don't have an electrical charge, and they often don't exist by themselves in nature, although every now and then they can. If we combine two or more atoms and they are bonded together, then that forms a molecule. The molecule is also typically neutral in charge, because if it wasn't neutral, it would want to break apart. Now, water is a bit of an exception because water does have a positive and a negative side. So it's not a very strong bond. In fact, it's a bond kind of unlike any other. That's part of what makes it so unique, is that it can exist as liquid, solid, and gas on the planet all at the same time. But then we have a third category, a third terminology that you need to understand, and that is an ion. And an ion is a particle that is positively or negatively charged. So what happens is the electron will be removed from the particle, kind of stolen and taken to another molecule, or an electron will be absorbed as two atoms bond together. And so anything that has an electrical charge, kind of like a magnet, is considered an ion. And this is important for our understanding of these essential elements and how they need to exist in the soil. So all of the minerals that our plants can absorb, they need to be taken in water. And so what is something that can dissolve into water? Well, it is a salt. And because water has polarity, salts, which are ions, and they have a charge, can easily blend in, break down, and dissolve into the water. So the essential elements that are available to our plants, they exist in the soil as salts. In chemistry, a salt is any chemical compound that is made of ions. Oftentimes, we think that salt is bad for the soil. Salt will hurt your plants. And in that circumstance, we're talking about like table salt or salty water, like ocean water. And really, what we're discussing there is sodium chloride, NaCl. But there are other types of salt. And a salt is any chemical compound that has a charge or is made of ions. These salts will then dissolve in water and be taken in by your plant. It doesn't matter what form of plant food or mineral supplement you give your plant, whether it's compost or fertilizer or anything else, it can only be taken in the form of a salt. So salt is not necessarily bad. It's just that sodium, too much NaCl, is bad for plant growth. And it's not that your roots can actually have little mouths that eat compost or anything like that. Whatever you add to the soil to help to keep the minerals available, your plants will only be able to absorb it as a salt. So, what's actually happening when the plant takes up the nutrients? What mechanism is the plant using to pull up these nutrients in a water soluble form? Well, first we have to take a look at the leaf. And in the leaves, there are small holes or small openings that we call stomates or stomata. And they open to take in carbon dioxide and to get rid of oxygen. This is an essential process that the leaf needs to go through in order to have the elements necessary for photosynthesis. In the process of getting rid of the O2, some water is released as well, water vapor. When the plant releases the water in the form of water vapor, it creates a vacuum because there's water all through the plant. Where did the plant get the water? It got it from the soil and through the roots. Through capillary action, the water molecules are pulled up through the cells, through the vascular system, through the veins of the leaves, and then out of the stomata. And when it releases water from the stomata, that vacuum triggers the suction or the pulling of more water from the soil, from the roots. And so, in order for the plant to be growing, producing sugar in the form of photosynthesis, and going through cellular respiration, the plant needs to be on this conveyor belt of water that's always taking place, always coming up from the soil and going out through the leaves. And that process needs to be relatively constant. So if we go down to the roots now and take a look at the source, where the water enters the plant, we notice there are some specialized organs where water and nutrients are more likely to be pulled in. In particular, on the root, there are specialized cells that have structures called hairs, root hairs. Visually, if you look at roots, you can tell if they have a lot of hairs or not, typically. But these are very fine, very thin, and really existing on a microscopic level. And it's these root hairs, the quantity and quality of root hairs on the roots that determine the rate at which water and nutrients can be taken up from the soil. We've learned about active and passive absorption, that there's two mechanisms by which water is pulled in through the roots. In the root hairs, there's passive absorption, which is through osmosis, and then there's the ability of the plant to create a differential by manipulating the salt content in the roots, and that actually uses energy from the plant to pull in water. Both of those mechanisms take place through the root hairs. Once the water and nutrients enters into the root hair, it is pulled in through the cells one by one toward the vascular system. The vascular system contains the transport pathways for two separate things. They don't necessarily mix. We have the xylem and we have the phloem. The xylem is where water moves, and in that water are the mineral ions that our plants will need. And the phloem is where the sugar with the energy moves. The way I remember it, I think food flows through the phloem. And the food in this case is the stuff with the energy, so the sugar. So the food flows through the phloem. The phloem typically is going downward. It's coming from the leaves down to the roots, and the xylem is going in the reverse direction from the roots up to the leaves. Why does the phloem need to take sugar down to the roots? Well, first of all, every cell needs sugar in order to carry out its processes, in order to go through its role in the organism. But additionally, we know that the plant gives some of the sugar out to the soil organisms. And those soil organisms will utilize that sugar in order to help break down and assimilate the mineral components that will become available to our plant's roots. So it all kind of works together. But once the minerals and water makes its way to the vascular system, then it is transported and spread to every other cell in the plant. So the water gets into the plant roots through active or passive absorption. But then when it moves from cell to cell, it is basically just using a concentration or a gradient. And we call that the water potential. And so it will move from one to the next based on a balancing. So if we have a higher concentration in one cell and a lower concentration in the next door neighbor, the water will move next door and it will keep passing along in a chain. And as long as there's always more water in the soil, you'll have water moving in a positive direction toward the vascular system. So nutrients, therefore, operate similarly. They will always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And so we need to have more minerals in the soil than we have in our plant's roots. That's typically not a problem because the mineral component of soil is literally made up of all of these minerals that our plants need. It's just making sure they're available. That's the tricky part. Now, interestingly, the plant has the ability to select where to send these minerals within the plant. If it doesn't matter, if there's no shortage, then the plant will just give every cell all of the minerals that it needs. But if there's a limitation or if there's a shortage, the plant can actually pull the minerals away from the cells that are less important and direct the essential elements toward the cells that are the most important. And what are the most important? It is anything that's responsible for growth or reproduction. So it can send the nutrients toward the newest growth and towards the reproductive organs of the plant. We call this nutrient mobility. It's the ability for nutrients to be moved within the plant to where it is needed most. So typically, a plant will supply more nutrients to its younger leaves than to its older leaves. It will sacrifice the older leaves, which are usually lower on the plant, in order to prioritize the ones that are higher up on the plant and the younger leaves. Some nutrients are mobile within the plant and some are not. And this becomes very useful for us because we can start to recognize deficiency symptoms based on whether or not they are showing up in the new leaves or in the old leaves. And that can tell us which element is missing if we know which ones are mobile and which ones are non-mobile. One easy thing to remember is that the three most important nutrients from the soil, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those are all mobile nutrients. And it's a good thing for the plant because they're needed in the highest quantity. So they're most likely oftentimes to be deficient. So that way the plant, if it encounters a deficiency, can compensate by moving those minerals within the plant. All the rest have varying degrees of mobility. Some are immobile and some are mobile. Some are kind of in between. But the three most important from the soil, NPK, those are mobile elements. So where will we see the deficiency symptoms of a lack of nitrogen, lack of phosphorus, or lack of potassium? We will typically see them in the older leaves because presumably the plant has removed those elements from the older leaves to send to the new leaves. So if we pay attention to our plant and can observe specific deficiency symptoms, we can get a clue into what is needed in the plants. So this is a little cartoon. It's not scientifically accurate, but it paints a fairly good picture. The main ones to recognize: nitrogen is going to be your primary nutrient that's most likely to be deficient. In this case, you'll see sort of a gradient along the plant where the oldest leaves will turn yellow and the youngest leaves will be green. And if the really bottom leaves, the whole leaf is yellow, the veins and the interveinal area is all yellow, that's a good indicator that you are deficient in nitrogen. Phosphorus is an interesting deficiency symptom because the leaf will actually turn darker green than normal. So you would think darker green is better, but if your plant is deficient in phosphorus, it limits the growth, and so you can still have photosynthesis, but it's in fewer cells. So the cells get more concentrated and they appear darker in color. And it can get so dark that it turns purple. So purple leaves are a deficiency symptom of phosphorus, which is often expressed in the lower leaves. And then potassium, you'll tend to have yellowing of the leaves around the tips and edges, the margins of the leaf. That's in sort of the younger leaf. But in the older leaves, you'll see necrosis or dead or yellow patches, which we call chlorosis. There's a whole bunch of other deficiency symptoms. I'll let you read through this on your own. We'll talk about them in greater detail next week. But the only other one I'll call your attention to now is iron, which is a micronutrient and expresses itself in the new growth, which tells us it's non-mobile. And there's a very characteristic deficiency symptom called interveinal chlorosis, where the veins will stay green, but the intervein, the space on the leaf where there's no veins, will turn yellow. And that's often seen here in San Diego because in alkaline soil, iron can be totally present but not available at a high pH. So here's an image showing interveinal chlorosis, showing the green veins with the yellow leaf. And that's a key indicator of an iron deficiency. You do want to be careful because sometimes what you're observing is not a deficiency at all, but could be caused by a disease or perhaps by an environmental factor. But if you are looking at a nutrient deficiency, some of these patterns can be very helpful. They can give you lots of guidance in how to provide for your plants. So a plant can express a nutrient deficiency in many ways. You can have a slowed growth rate. So you can have stunted plants, deformed growth. So the leaves can be curled and growing in strange patterns. You can have discoloration, you can have distress, and even you can have death in parts of the plant. Oftentimes, it's tricky because if you are deficient in one thing, you're probably going to be deficient in another of the 17 essential elements. And so it's not enough just to recognize these by themselves. You have to think kind of on how they would work in combination. But typically, because nitrogen is the number one needed element from the soil, that's going to be the one that's usually in shortest supply. So when we add plant food, fertilizer, oftentimes we're really trying to add the nitrogen because of Liebig's law. If we add nitrogen, all the rest should be available up until the next limiting factor. Now, how do plants get nitrogen? We know they get it in a water-soluble form. We've talked about some of the roles that bacteria and fungi play in the soil with soil ecology. And here we see a little bit closer look at the rhizobium bacteria. Most of the legume plants have this very special characteristic of a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, where the plant builds the nodule, it builds the house, it builds that little structure on the root, and then the bacteria occupies the house. And in soils where nitrogen is lacking, the bacteria will produce the nitrogen and it's able to fix that nitrogen, meaning it can take in the atmospheric nitrogen, which comes in the form of N2. That is not an ion, that's a molecule. N2 does not have a charge, but the bacteria can convert the N2 into ammonium, NH4 plus. You see the plus? That tells you it's got a charge, so it's an ion. So ammonium is available to your plant's roots because it's water soluble. And the image on the top right shows actually the bacteria, that pink fleshy looking substance, almost looks like raw meat. Well, it's full of nitrogen. And so it's actually not too dissimilar from the hemoglobin in your blood as far as what it's made out of and how it operates. And so in this case, for legume plants, they have special bacteria that live inside their roots and can supply them with the water soluble nitrogen in the form of ammonium. This is a great adaptation because the Earth's atmosphere is almost 80% nitrogen. So it's widely abundant and easy to access. Most of the other plants need to absorb this nitrogen after it has passed through bacteria in the soil. But for legume plants, they have this special symbiotic relationship, mutual relationship with rhizobium bacteria. This is why farmers, agriculturalists, often have crop rotation where they plant a legume or a bean crop in between planting other crops that require a lot of food or a lot of nitrogen. And so, for instance, corn requires lots of nitrogen. And so, if you're a corn farmer in the Midwest, for instance, you are probably also a soybean farmer. Corn and soy go hand in hand, and you rotate them in a field because after the corn, your soil will be nitrogen deficient. You grow soybeans, and they do not need nitrogen from the soil, they can get it from their association with rhizobium bacteria. Then you come along, you harvest the beans, but you till up all the roots and then you leave them there. Well, what happens is the nitrogen that was in the roots decomposes, breaks down, other bacteria eat it, mineralize it, and then make it available to your plants once they are eaten by the protozoas. And now you've got a little food web in your soil that was enabled because you rotated your crops with a nitrogen fixing plant. And alfalfa is the same. It's a widely used animal food is alfalfa, and that also is a legume crop. And then we have mycorrhizal fungi. We spoke about these when discussing soil ecology as well. A lot of people get the mycorrhizal fungi and the rhizobium bacteria mixed up. They forget who does what. So rhizobium bacteria is just for nitrogen. Mycorrhizal fungi is another symbiotic relationship where the fungus works alongside the plant. And basically, the fungus acts like an extension of the roots. So in the image on the top, we can see some pine seedlings, and their roots would normally be relatively small. In fact, you can see where the roots are, but it's only kind of the golden color, the thicker material. And the very bright white is all of the mycelium of the mycorrhizal fungi. And notice how much more surface area and how much more ability to collect minerals and water exists when the plant has a boost, has an extra connection. And what's more is now those two pine seedlings can actually be connected to each other because that fungus can be one organism. It's not necessarily two fungi for for two separate plants. It's the same organism. And so the saplings will feed the fungus with sugar, and in exchange, the fungus will produce enzymes that break down the minerals from the soil and make them available to the plants. And so, say one of the saplings was a little bit weak and could not give as much sugar, but the other one was strong and was able to give plenty of sugar because it's connected to a single fungus. Then the fungus can get most of its energy from the healthy plant, but still give minerals to the plant that's less healthy. And this is how a forest operates. This is how an ecosystem really takes place, where all of the plants, they're not necessarily existing in isolation. And there is, of course, competition in nature, and there's competition among plants for light and for soil minerals. But there's also cooperation at the same time. And more, we are discovering the important role that cooperation plays in the form of an association with this mycorrhizal fungi. We think almost every plant in nature has an association with a mycorrhizal fungus. Remember, they can be ectomycorrhizal or endomycorrhizal. That's just different ways they attach to the plant. But almost every plant out there has some form of symbiotic relationship with some species of fungus. And there's only a few that we've identified that clearly do not. And so, yes, your plants can grow without any mycorrhizal fungi, but if they have it, they're going to be much more successful at collecting the water and the minerals that they need. It's a boost to their roots. So, I mentioned all of the plants in nature have these mycorrhizal associations. And you may think, okay, well, what about San Diego? We don't have a whole lot of fungus in the soil. I don't see mushrooms popping up everywhere. And surely in dry areas, we won't necessarily have these connections. But that may be what you would initially think, but it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, we do have these mycorrhizal fungi in our native habitats. And you can imagine that they're even more important because the water is less available. So if water is more scarce, it's going to be much more important as a plant to be connected in to a living network that can help to move water and minerals around in the soil. So yes, we do have mycorrhizal fungi here, and the plants that are here are perfectly adapted to work with our local species of fungi. In fact, most soil conditions across the world will provide any plant that is adapted to that climate with everything that it needs from a mineral standpoint. So you can get sufficient nutrition for a complete plant life cycle without the addition of nutrients as fertilizer if you select plants that are climate appropriate, because in their native habitat, wherever that is, they are going to have very similar conditions to the climate that you are in, which is why Mediterranean climate plants, such as the ones we plant in our landscape, similar to California climate, they're so important because they don't need as much mineral fertilizer. They are ready to have drought in the summer. They are ready to have the soil types that we have in our region. And so much can be just much more harmonious with nature if we try to stick to a climate profile and stay within that. It's once you reach out of the natural climate range that you start to have plants that will need fertilizer. And it's kind of an interesting thing where maybe you don't need fertilizer for all your plants, but your plants will benefit from the addition of some fertilizer, because some of these plants have very broad ranges and they do well in some areas and they can survive in others, but maybe not thrive. But it's important to understand that if you stick with your climate profile, you will need to add much less fertilizer in any form, whether it's organic or synthetic. And finally, when it comes to agriculture, uh, this is not a natural ecosystem in the least. There could almost be nothing more unnatural than a farm, which typically consists of very straight rows of the same kind of plant over and over and over again, regardless of where it came from. And we'll give the plant all the fertility that it needs. We'll give it all the water that it needs, and then we'll come and we'll harvest it, and we'll leave behind some soil that needs to be built back up again if it's going to grow more plants. So when we're talking about agriculture, it is inherently an artificial system. And so we will always need to be managing the soil or adding fertility back into the soil. Again, we can add it in the form of organic fertilizer or synthetic fertilizer. We're just always going to need to add something back, because an agriculture is inherently an extractive process. You are removing plant material and then sending it somewhere else for people to eat. Those minerals that are literally in the cells of those plants need to be replaced. And if you do not replace them over time, you will deplete the soil of minerals and you will have less vigorous growth. You will not be able to even sustain any kind of a yield. You'll see gradual decline and an eventual depletion of the minerals in the soil. So when we talk agriculture, we're always going to be talking about fertility management and how do we add soil back into the ecosystem. So there we go. There is an introduction to plant nutrition as it relates to minerals in the soil. And this is kind of more conceptual about what's actually taking place, what mechanisms are at play, and how does it work on an individual basis as well as an ecosystem level. And next time with part 2, we're going to discuss all of those 17 elements in particular and what they do for the plant, what is the deficiency symptom, and maybe even what's a toxicity symptom of these essential elements in the soil. I hope you find this interesting, informative, and useful in your daily life. And if you have questions, as always, feel free to reach out in the Q&A discussion or email me in the Canvas inbox. Thanks a lot.